Hi, class. All right, so we are going to get started on chapter 4 today. And let me just share my screen here. You'll find these PowerPoints along with the video in the module. Okay. So some of our objectives for chapter 4, we're going to be talking about inclusion, what that exactly means, who we include, everybody. Idea, part A and B, and we'll cover what that means as well, and then some common childhood conditions. So the frequent, most common, but typically chronic conditions that young children will face, and then how their development can be affected by them. So to start off with inclusion, inclusion really looks like a lot of different things, but inclusion, the point of it is to promote understanding for people with differences. And the reality is we're all different, right? We all need to feel included. So it can look like a child that has recently immigrated from another country and is not familiar with the language. It can look like a child with a chronic medical condition that needs regular management and monitoring, and they also need their peers to include them and to not misunderstand what's going on with them. This is true for everybody. It also includes children with troubling behaviors. We sometimes don't want to include them because they're hard or they're not really enjoyable to be around. But the reality is, and we've talked a little bit about this, is that children are a product of their environment to some degree, to most of the degree, and it's really important that we see their behavior as symptoms of what's going on with them emotionally. And so to exclude them or make them feel worse because of their behavior really just probably perpetuates that cycle. So we still have to include those kids. And we have to include our creatives, right? Our kids that are always thinking about something else other than what you're trying to get them to think about. That can be really frustrating at times. A lot of kids that have trouble with attention are just coming up with all kinds of other ideas in their head. And while as a teacher, when you want them to focus on something or you're trying to figure out if they've learned that skill, it can be a challenge. It's actually really amazing to see what some of these children can produce as adults that are allowed more freedom with their creativity. And unfortunately, sometimes our most creative geniuses are adults that say they had really difficult childhoods because they were really misunderstood. Inclusion can also look like children with disabilities, whether that's learning disabilities, whether that's physical disabilities. We could go on and on and on about differences, right? There are so many, but it's really just integrating children of all abilities and recognizing that every child, irregardless of where they've come from, what conditions they're dealing with, how their mind works, what their life is at home, and the emotional needs they might have, making sure that we recognize they do all have abilities in a classroom and that we try to provide instruction that meets those needs. Right? It's really important that we remember that basic fundamental that we are the same and we have the same basic needs like food, shelter, love, emotion, or attention, dignity, and respect, and that irregardless of our differences, these need to be met. And we can do that in a classroom by making sure that children feel included. So all children must have equal access to high quality educational experiences and opportunities if they're to achieve their fullest potential. And so it really was in 2004, which doesn't actually feel that long ago, that the term IDEA came into play, which stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. Improvement doesn't get a letter in the term of IDEA, but this law that was passed was for all children to have the same right to an appropriate education and services needed to succeed. So even though the term or the law uses the term disabilities, it's important to remember that a child is not a disability first. It's easy sometimes to, I know in the hospital environment where I work, also, sometimes it's easy to say, oh, that oncology kid, oh, that, seizure kid. It's easy to kind of talk to them in terms of their diagnosis. And we can do that sometimes when we put labels on young children in a classroom too, but it's important to not do that. We want to use something called person-first language. And that really, I feel like that's the first layer of respect. If you can't even address the child as a child first, but you want to call them by a label or a diagnosis, you're going to have a hard time providing individualized classroom modifications and making their learning environment successful for them if you can't even think of them as a child first. And so person-first language does that. It's where you address an individual as the individual first and not by their disability. So instead of saying an autistic, you would say a child with autism. It feels like a minor difference, but it actually is, I think, pretty essential. Like I said, that first step to really being able to embrace the idea of inclusion in your classroom. So if we look at IDEA, there's different parts to it. Part A is really about goals. And so we want to think about how do we identify early what's going on, get intervention services and family involved, and have that comprehensive evaluation to even see if the child qualifies. Child development, just in general, is a spectrum. It's not the same path for every child, but typically the same, you have to hit the same steps along the way, even though you can take kind of some different routes to it or a longer time in between each step. And so the evaluation really determines, okay, is this just part of this child's sort of normal trajectory and they really are still on target, or are they headed down another path that we need to try to correct and get them back on the same path? So that's the evaluation process. Then part B is really kind of what it is, right? It's an individualized education plan that is developed based on the evaluation from part A, with the services or the interventions that are needed that have been identified as helpful for this child. For the ages of 3 to 22, the focus is on developmental and academic goals. For the younger kids, if they are not that old yet, then 0 to 3-year-old, they receive something called an individualized family service plan. So the effort is not so much on academics and education, but it is on helping that child catch up developmentally, whether it's gross motor, fine motor, language development, and getting the intervention services involved, speech therapy, things like that that might be needed, to try to get that child more on track so that when they do start school, they are not behind their peers as much. And then for children with a chronic health condition, they are given an individualized health services plan. And that really just focuses on the healthcare needs. So it could be they have both. They could have an IHSP and an IEP, so education and health services, But if they just have a chronic condition that needs to be managed, but their development is still on track and they're still meeting their educational milestones, then they might just have a health services plan. And this focuses on making sure that child is cared for while at school with whatever they need based on their condition, that there's a plan in place for safety, there's a plan in place for any kind of an emergency that might arise, that the staff feels like they know what to do for this child's medical needs until they can seek further help or get a hold of the parents. Okay, so when as we're thinking about common childhood medical conditions, the first thing we want to think about really is if you feel like as a teacher that there is something going on with this child, it can be really helpful before you want to either, label a condition, that you really think about their environment, because an environment can not only have an effect on our health, but it can also have an effect on our ability to develop properly. And all of it's interrelated. So if your health is suffering, your education is suffering. We can't tweeze those apart for children. They're not able, we can't really do it for adults either, although adults like to think they can compartmentalize different parts of their life, and that doesn't always work out. But young children can't. So if they are suffering physically from something that's gone undiagnosed, it will affect their education, their ability to learn, their cognitive development, all the developments. If they have a condition that is affecting that, that will affect their ability to learn. So it's all interrelated. But one of the things that we should think about first is, before thinking about, I think they have a medical problem, is think about their environment. Just like their emotional and physical and or emotional and social well-being is wrapped up in their environment, so is their physical health. And so if we need to think about, where is their home located? Are they living in something that's clean, in an area that is safe? Do they have access to medical care? Do they have nutritious food to eat? Are they even able to get to a grocery store easily that offers a variety of produce and vegetables and things like that? Sometimes that's not the case. Are there environmental pollutants? Here in the Valley, we are saturated by agriculture, which is wonderful, but it's also a really common air pollutant. And then because we're a valley, right, other pollution from other places likes to settle over us. And so we get a little bit of everything. And so thinking about the environment and the pollutants, those are sometimes things we can't change, right? We can't transport ourselves out of the valley. So we just have to deal with the ramifications if we have physical issues. But there are some environmental pollutants, like, older homes that used to have lead in their paint, or toys that used to be made with lead, and that would very much affect young children's health. Also their environment, right? We've talked a little bit about toxic stress and the family and what that can cause on children. We know that it has a long-term effect. If you have done how toxic stress affects childhood or affects children and into adulthood, you have learned a little bit about that. But if you have a child that's regularly coming to you with a tummy ache or with a headache, just isn't feeling well each day, and you've kind of weeded out some of these other obvious environmental issues, then it might be time to talk about, hey, is something going on at home? Because when children are feeling stressed or scared or anxious or worried about home life, it manifests itself a lot of times physically. All right, so there are essentially many different childhood conditions that we could talk about. Your book goes into a little bit more of them than I'm going to discuss in lecture. So you definitely need to familiarize yourself with the ones that are in your book, like seizures and cancer and things like that. But we are going to talk about the 3 A's because these are the most common childhood conditions that you're going to probably encounter on a fairly regular basis, probably. The first A being allergies. So an allergy is, well, any substance that can cause an allergic reaction is called an allergen. When you have allergies, it means that you are having a reaction to multiple different types of allergens. The most common are typically from something called ingestants, which are things that we eat or ingest. Inhalants, so things that we inhale or breathe in. Contactants, so things that we contact or touch. Or injectables, things that poke into us, such as a bee sting. Something like that would be a good example. So these are some of the most common ones. We've got skin contactants, so that would be like rubbing up against a poisonous plant, like poison oak, if you've ever had that, and it itches like crazy. Or animal dander, so you pet the cat and then now you're sneezing and wheezing. Pollen can be a contactant, depending on what kind of plants you're actually touching. Latex as well. Then we have injections, so that usually encompasses different types of medications, or like I said, bee stings. It could be other type of stinging animals or insects. Ingestions, that can also be medication. It can also be things that you eat, like foods that you are allergic to. The most common, obviously, being nuts and shellfish, things like that. But it's important to know what children know that they are allergic to. And then inhalants, so some of the same things like the animal dander and the pollen, you can also breathe in, especially during certain times of the year, around spring, when pollen is everywhere because there's so many blossoms. But it also can be, depending on your environment, mold and mildew, dust, other kind of particles in the air. Those can all create allergic reactions. Okay, so we talked a little bit about allergens, the different types that are most common. And the main thing to know about allergies is that there's no cure. The only cure is to stay away and avoid that allergen. And sometimes, like I said, that's not possible. Sometimes you have to breathe air. You always have to breathe air. And so if you're in an area like we live where the air quality is poor at times, you're probably going to notice that your allergies are worse. So there isn't a cure, but you can have what's called symptomatic control, which means you're avoiding or trying to lessen the symptoms that those allergies cause or allergens cause. And so that might mean you're taking a medication. It could also mean that you might have to not have a certain kind of pet because you're allergic to them. You're trying to keep your environment free of those allergens. Or you're using, when you can't, you're using medication to help clear your sinuses and things like that. Anaphylaxis. So this is when you've come into contact with an allergen and you're having a severe reaction. So it's not just, oh, my nose is so stuffy, I can't breathe out of it. It is, my throat is closing, I cannot breathe, things are swelling up on my body, potentially children can lose consciousness, even die. If it's not treated right away. It's a life-threatening emergency. That's why many children that have severe allergies, or adults as well, they carry something called an EpiPen, right? Because we don't want this to happen. We don't want any kind of facial swelling. That is a life-threatening emergency, because if something is swelling, you don't know that there isn't something swelling inside as well. And so that's an emergency as well. So always make sure that if you know of a severe allergic reaction in the past, that you immediately find out from the family, hey, what's the plan? What do you have in place if they were to come in contact with that again? We can do our best to control this environment, but it's not 100%, right? And so do we have an EpiPen? Have you talked to your pediatrician about having that? Can we have one here? Can we be trained? Those are really important things to make sure that you have in place for children with severe allergies, because it's incredibly scary. Okay, next one, asthma. So asthma is essentially where, and it's very common, many of you probably have it, but it's where you have kind of a thickening of the airway wall. There's a inflammation, it narrows the ability for airflow, the muscles tighten, everything's inflamed, and it makes, or your airways start producing more secretions or mucus, and that makes, takes up even more space in that airway. So not only is there limited airflow, but now it's starting to fill up with a liquid. So it's very scary. A lot of times, not only does it, you can see the physical exertion that it takes for breathing, but then you also hear this rattling noise, and that's all that mucus kind of rattling around in there. This can be exacerbated many different ways. One concern is that we're seeing an increasing alarming rate of asthma. More and more children are being diagnosed even earlier and earlier. I believe, and I can't remember if it says that in that TED Talk with Dr. Nadine, but sometimes asthma is produced from stress. And so it could, some of these conditions could even be signs of stress that child's going through currently in their childhood. But there's also sometimes when we don't know why young children are being diagnosed with asthma. There have been some theories like vitamin D deficiency. We slather sunscreen on everybody now when they walk out the door, and they might not be getting enough vitamin D. We get vitamin D from the sun. Our body doesn't produce it. And so if we've got sunscreen over every part of our skin that is exposed to the sun, then a lot of times it doesn't allow for as much vitamin D as we need. Or just a sedentary lifestyle where you're inside more is going to mean you're not getting as much vitamin D as well. There is a balance, of course, because you don't want to go out with no sunscreen or be out in the sun for a prolonged period of time, but it's one theory. Also exposure to pollutants, right? So here in the Valley, we're breathing in all kinds of different pollutants regularly. Early feeding practices. This is an interesting one because there are studies that have shown a relationship between breastfeeding and decreased incidence of asthma. So children that are breastfed don't as often develop asthma as children that are formula fed. There are so many other variables in a child's life that it is hard to say that would be the specific one, but it's a relationship that they have noticed in research. It's not a cause. Feeding your baby formula will not cause asthma, but they're recognizing that there is a relationship there. And like I said, stress as well. Some known causes are definitely things that we breathe in. So here in the Valley, we probably have very high incidences of asthma because we're always breathing in toxins. Certain foods, if you're allergic to certain foods, it can create an asthma-like response. Secondhand cigarette smoke. If you're around a smoker, or if you are a smoker, you're probably much more likely to have to deal with asthma. Illnesses such as colds or bronchitis, things that really affect the airway. Those are going to, whether they cause asthma or whether it just exacerbates what you already are dealing with, but it can. Stress and fatigue as well. Temperature changes can exacerbate it as well. Sometimes some people don't really have asthma much at all, except for when they try to exercise, and it can be induced by vigorous exercise. Not like walking, just to be clear. Some exercise is good, but if you decide to take off in a sprint and you've had a history of asthma, you might notice that it's a little bit worse. I think I feel like I have asthma, and I don't when I run. Okay, so some things to do. Sorry, guys. Oh, well, I have it on this page, but I don't have it on my slides, I guess. So some ways to encourage a child when they're having an asthma attack, and you want to just have them relax first off. Have them stop whatever activity that they were doing that might have been causing it, especially if they were running around, breathing heavy. Notice what's going on when they start to feel that asthma attack coming on. If they were eating something new, then take note of that. You want to administer any prescribed medications that you've had training on, that you have a doctor's note for. If we're thinking about a childcare or a preschool or a school setting, there already has to be a plan in place that's been signed by the physician and the parents for you to administer any medications. Some places don't do that at all. Some choose to just call the parent if an issue arises. So, you know, there's different ways to handle it, but you have to have a plan in place. You can't just pull out something that you have in your purse and say, hey, just try this for right now, and then I'll call your parents. Like, that's a no-no. You want to monitor their breathing. So you want to document what's happening, what signs you're seeing, what symptoms they're experiencing. You want to be detailed in your information. Like we talked a little bit more about with the daily health checks, this is a moment where you want to get some real details down so that when you call parents, you can really explain to them thoroughly to give them a picture of what's happening. And then obviously if it's a prolonged attack, what you're doing is not working and you're feeling like they're really in distress, breathing is the number one thing that we need to do first and foremost. So you need to call 911 and get assistance, right? Notify the child's family and get that emergency plan in place. Okay, now we're moving on to anemia. So this is our third A, allergies, asthma, and now anemia. So anemia is a common blood disorder. It's when too few red blood cells develop, and we need too few red blood cells are available, to deliver oxygen to the body's cells. So oxygen, when we breathe oxygen in, it goes into our lungs, and then our lungs give it to our blood supply. That oxygen catches a ride with the red blood cells that are part of our blood, and those red blood cells, when our heart is pumping, it takes it to all of our cells, right? All of our organs, all of our cells in our body. And so this is very important because we need all of our cells to receive oxygen. If we don't, it can cause some real problems. Okay, so why is anemia a problem? Anemia is a problem because it's actually a symptom. It's not a condition. I know this is getting weird here, but it is a symptom of something worse, or something, not always something worse, but something else is going on, and that's causing anemia. It's not its own disease specifically. Typically, the most common causes are going to be For young children, and especially the toddler age group, it is going to be a nutrition issue. That's majority of what it is. It can also be related to other things like, let me just bring them up. Sickle cell disease, other types of infection, chronic infections a child might have. It can be related to cancers. It can be caused by certain medications that a child might take or a chemical exposure, but those are much, much more rare. For our young toddler age group, especially, or into that preschool age group when they're highly picky about what they eat, the majority of toddlers don't want to eat things with a lot of iron, like meats and like our green leafy vegetables. And that's a texture thing. That's a, I don't have that many teeth and it's hard to chew thing for young children. They're used to very soft pureed foods. And then when we start giving them small bites of real food with its real texture, it takes some adjustment. That in combination with children will want to drink a large amount of milk a lot of times. Milk is good for you, but you can have too much of a good thing. And so if a child is just constantly getting full on milk, they're not going to want to eat these other foods that give them those other nutrients. And so it's really important that young children not just be given milk as a substitute for their hunger, but that they are asked or expected to eat a little bit. I mean, and when I say little bit, I am talking like, even this picture that's on the slide is not appropriate, right? I would never think a toddler would eat that many vegetables. I shouldn't have picked that picture. But a toddler's palm is a really good indication of the amount of bites you should consider giving them to start with. If they're still hungry after they eat and they want more, you can give them another bite or two. But a toddler's palm, I mean, we're not even talking the finger part, we're just talking the palm of their hand. It's tiny, right? How many bites might actually fit on there? 2 or 3 little tiny cut up bites. Start with that and give them that and try to have them eat that. If they won't eat it, and we'll talk more about this in our nutrition section, but then the answer is, okay, you don't have to eat it, but when you're hungry later, this is what you can have. Right? You're not going to get a glass full of milk instead, because that will kind of cure their hunger. That will fill that little belly, that little stomach that they have, but then they will not want to eat foods with other nutrients. So they get a few little bites of just a couple little things. And then if they want more, if they've eaten it and they want more, they can have that. Or if they eat it, then they can have some milk. But what we find with young children with anemia a lot of times is that they are just filling up on milk and they're not getting the iron that they need from a lot of the food groups that they typically don't want to eat anyway. So it's a tricky age when it comes to feeding, but it can cause anemia. So it's important to watch out for. And what you'll notice is with children with anemia, it's a slow process. So sometimes you don't notice it until it's kind of severe, but they're usually very fatigued. They don't have the energy level that they typically would have at home. You kind of just want to lay around more. Maybe they're sleeping longer. And at first that probably feels great. If you've ever been around a high-strung toddler, you're happy for them to have just a little less energy, but then they'll also lose a lot of color. So they'll be very, very pale. And again, since it's a gradual process, it's sometimes hard to pick up on until it's pretty severe, but it's important to watch for. And really the first clue that they're at risk for it is, what are their nutrition habits? Okay, we're not doing the book review because we are not in class together, so I did not switch that slide. But one thing I want to show you, and I need to switch over here, is a really great website called Kids Health. It's kidshealth.org. And here is where you can go to their search engine. I mean, you can look at it, this way, like different conditions and diseases. They have all different topics. This is information geared towards talking to parents. This is information for kids. So this can be a great resource, especially in your classrooms, if you are trying to help children understand more about a certain topic, whether it's just being healthy, their feelings, staying safe. But if you have a child with a specific condition that you're having to monitor in class, and you're having other children see you do that, like they're seeing you give little Johnny an inhaler, they may have questions. They may wonder, why is he getting that? Or why does he get that special treatment? They might think it's cool, right? I mean, I always wanted a broken arm, so I had a cast. How dumb, right? But as a kid, you don't see it as a problem. You see it as they're getting all these signatures on their cast and people are giving them attention, and that seems so great. So it's helpful so that other children in the class understand what's going on too. And you have to have a conversation with the parents to make sure that they're comfortable with what you share. But provided the parents are okay with that and the child feels comfortable, it can be an important topic to have so that that child feels included, right? Because we were talking about inclusion. So that's really important. So you can really go to anything. You can go here and search, and we could type in. Okay, and so then it's going to give us a list of different resources. So Asthma Center for Kids. If you don't know much about asthma, this is the place to go. So let's go here. And then again, you're going to have just lots of different information, like basic, probably definition of asthma, an asthma movie. So you can review that and see, is this something that would be helpful, to show my class, that would help them understand? Is it age appropriate for the class that you're talking with? How to handle a flare up. So if you're finding that you have a child that's not managing their illness well, you're certainly not a doctor, right? This should come from a pediatrician, but these can be some resources that you could at least suggest to parents. And just to help yourself feel more educated and understand more about what your student is going through. This can be a good resource. So I wanted to share that with you. Again, your book covers many others. Diabetes is a really important one for you guys to focus on. A lot of times I will lecture about that one in class as well, because it's just very common, and it requires a lot on the teacher's part to help manage and monitor, especially for younger kids. And so it's important to know about that. Seizures as well. Those can be actually pretty common, but they're pretty concerning if you have never experienced one or witnessed one. And so it's important to just familiarize yourself with those that are in the book as well. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I am happy to talk more about it, or give you some other resources or examples, things like that. If you've dealt with any of these types of conditions with some of the kids that you've had experiences with, it would be great to hear some of your feedback as well. Okay, thanks guys.